you want to start off with a reading from the book, and then we'll get to talking about it?
Oh, sure. Does it matter which one? Okay, I have 3 little snippets. I'm going to read one, and then we'll talk, and I'll read the second. And I have to figure out how to do this with the mic in my hand. I have these pages, and I have to take off my glasses because I'm of that age. All right. Ernest Lehman not only looked the part of a powerful Hollywood executive, but was also known as one of the saner individuals in the industry, level-headed, methodical, and circumspect. He was seasoned enough to understand what the stakes were as the first-time Hollywood producer of a highly anticipated film, and sophisticated enough to recognize the era-defining nature of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf and the phenomenon it had the potential to become. His priorities were in the right place, meaning that he upheld a fidelity to the essential content and meaning of the project. In this case, Albie's play. Lehman had excellent instincts and he had taste. He had just returned from a scouting expedition in London to see Uta Hagen and Arthur Hill in the West End production of Virginia Woolf. The first draft of the screenplay was due in September. As he worked on the script in his office at Warner Brothers, he was simultaneously making lists of actors to cast for George and Martha, as well as lists of possible directors, cinematographers, and production designers. While Jack Warner had given Albee his word about casting Bette Davis as Martha and James Mason as George, Lehman had ideas of his own. He scrawled a list of Marthas on his notepad in this order: Ingrid Bergman, Uta Hagen, Nancy Kelly, Anne Bancroft, Patricia Neal, Shelley Winters, Bette Davis, Deborah Kerr, Geraldine Page, and Vivica Linfors. Not only was Davis far from the top of the list, but the name of the eventual on-screen Martha was nowhere to be found. Lehman alone knew that this was really his B-list. I started getting very excited about the idea of Elizabeth Taylor, which I kept a deep, dark secret, because everyone in town was playing the game of casting this picture, Lehman would later explain. Every actress wanted to play the role, he said. I was an open target for every agent. I had to barricade myself. He knew that if he floated the idea of Elizabeth Taylor for the role of Martha, everyone would try to talk him out of it. He himself could parrot all the arguments against casting her. She was 20 years younger than the character. She had never played such a psychologically complex role, and on a purely practical level, her conspicuous sense of entitlement had grown to monarchical proportions. The opulence of Cleopatra's palace would pale next to the extravagance of Burton and Taylor's life together, with its yacht, its jewels, its furs, its entourages, its champagne and caviar, the 5-star hotels, the Van Goghs and Matisses and Pissaros, write Sam Cashner and Nancy Schoenberger. Why did I think Elizabeth would be right? Lehman mused. I sensed certain wavelengths in her personality akin to Martha. I don't mean she is a shrew or tears husbands to shreds, but I think she has a deeply feminine vulnerability. People know how good Uta Hagen played her. They would certainly know how Bette Davis would do it, but they would wonder how Elizabeth Taylor would do it. So.
All right, I'm glad you read that snippet because I have a question I'm going to get to about precisely that in a minute. But I think you have 2 more to read as we go along, right? So you tell me when, if you ever want to call a timeout, or if what I ask you reminds you of something you're going to read, it's up to you to tell me when. I just want to start off by saying, I think the reason that my agent, who you share, we have the same agent, Adam Eaglin, who couldn't be here because he's traveling, but he's a great guy, really cares about books and ideas, and I think you developed this book a lot with him in the early days, right?
Absolutely, yes, I did.
I think he gave it to me, asked me if I wanted to blurb it and interview you about it, etc., because he knows that I have a weakness for books about single movies, about the production of a single movie. Like Algene Harmon's book about The Wizard of Oz, I don't know if you know that, but that's a classic. Or there's a great book by Ronald Haver on A Star is Born, and Judy Garland's Star is Born. Anytime that you've got a rocky production history and somebody's just following all the travails of making a movie, I love that kind of story, and that's the kind of story this book tells. And boy, was it rocky. There's so much to get into.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the blurb.
Oh yeah, well it was utterly sincere. Also, just on a personal note, right before the pandemic started, remember how Virginia Woolf was about to go up on Broadway with Laurie Metcalf as Martha?
Yes.
So I had an assignment at the time in early 2020, late 2019, to write on that for The Atlantic, and I was supposed to dig deep into the history of the play and the movie, and it was before Mike Nichols, the biography by Mark Harris had come out, and I was just going on this deep rabbit hole dive and was so into the play, and I was going to go see it in previews and everything, and then COVID came, and the play didn't happen, and the piece didn't happen, and all the research went by the wayside. So this is also a chance to nerd out with you about about a movie that I have read a lot about, but I still learned a lot from reading this book. So maybe the unifying theme of this book, as you see in the subtitle, is that Who's Afraid is a movie about a marriage, but it's also a movie about marriage, the institution,
That's
right?
Yes.
And the whole existence of the film, as you show in the early part of the book, arises from this nested series of either marriages or, you know, at the time there was no gay marriage legally, but, you know, romantic relationships. So it starts off with Edward Albee's romantic fling with Terrence McNally while he's writing the play in the summer of 61, it would be, right? And then there's the marriage between, I want you to talk about this a bit, between Willard Moss and Marie Menken, who Albee cited as some of the inspirations for George and Martha, who Andy Warhol calls the last of the great bohemians. You quote that in the book, right? So they're in there somewhere. Then of course there's the fictional marriage of George and Martha, and then after the movie starts to get made, there's the real life marriage of Burton and Taylor, and so it was just like this Russian doll series of love relationships and marriages that give rise to the story. And I wanted you to maybe just talk about how that framing came to be. Why did you decide I need to frame a book about this movie in terms of marriage?
It goes back to my the first time I saw Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf when I was 15, and it somehow, my parents, I asked them if I could see it. They said, you're not going to understand it. I saw it, they were fine that I saw it. I didn't understand it, but somehow I knew that it was the truth. It's one of the first movies that I was conscious of that actually identified the truth. I couldn't define that specifically at the time, but I recognized my parents in it. And of course, I mean, I think all kids are like, you know, the deepest, truest psychologists of their parents. And I was fascinated by my parents' relationship because it was not unlike George and Martha's. I mean, they were also very civilized and things would go for a long time, you know, like every other marriage. But they would erupt and they would argue, and it was scary to me. And I lived with the fear of their getting divorced my entire childhood, and they didn't. And that became a riddle, basically the riddle of a lifetime for me. Why didn't my parents get divorced? And then I, you know, started looking at other marriages. I mean, just as, you know, not seriously, but, you know, my friends' parents, and, you know, my friends' relationships, and it just became a riddle that I actually started to realize was, you know, marriage is a very large thing. It's like, you know, as I say in the introduction, when I was a kid, marriage was like, it was an institution. It was like government or politics. Like marriage was a real institution. And so I just became fascinated. I've always been fascinated by marriage. And Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, over the years, you know, I don't know, I sort of check in with myself about my 10 best lists of things, you know, my favorite books, my favorite movies, and those changed over the years because we change, and you know, your tastes change and your knowledge changes, and, you know, and every time I made that list in my mind, you know, when I was 23 and when I was 38 and whatever, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf was at the top of it, always. And I mean, it's always, to me, it is the movie of movies, ultimately. And that's just my taste, but it's because I think it puts its finger on something so true about marriage itself. So there's that. And then in thinking about this book, well, first of all, when I thought about my next book, I'd finished a biography of Richard Avedon, and I thought, well, now what? Now what am I going to write? And that was such a delicious experience to spend 5 years mining him as an avatar of culture in the second half of the 20th century. I thought, well, what's going to do that for me now? And I mean, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf kept coming back to me. It's like, I really would like to mine this. And then I realized, well, Edward Albee wrote it. I mean, I knew this, but I sort of made this aha connection. And I thought, Edward Albee is really interesting. He's a seminal figure in theater in the 20th century, you know, a father of theater of the absurd. And when I was in college, I guess, the theater of the absurd was progressive, and it was countercultural, and it was entertaining. And so I was fascinated by Albee then in college. Anyway, so one thing led to another in terms of my interest in writing about the movie, writing about Albee. And then when I started to unnest several of these movies, I think one of the highlights of writing this book and researching was discovering Willard Mass and Marie Menken. And to identify them as the source of George and Martha in Edward Albee's imagination. And that to me was a major link. I'm hesitating because so very briefly, yes, Andy Warhol said they were the last of the great bohemians. They lived in, kind of overlapping circles of the zeitgeist in the 1950s. Edward Albee knew them, Andy Warhol knew them, they knew everybody, in fact. They knew the New York poets. They would have these wild parties, and they were known to get really plastered and argue with each other in front of the guests, George and Martha. What's most compelling to me about that discovery is that I always thought that George and Martha, in my own stream of consciousness, imagination, they knew something. They were not just these suburban, small college people. They were worldly and cultivated. I don't know how I arrived at the conclusion. Maybe it was my fantasy, when I was young. But it gave foundation to that idea about them. And I started to think about the fact that Willard and Marie, if they came out of, bohemian New York 1950s, they represented a set of values. And this is something I didn't get in the book. I only thought of it later. But I think it's true. I think this is really true. And those values are kind of founded on the ideas at that time. And those ideas were Freudian psychology, Marxist ideology, and French existentialism. And so, I don't know how I arrived at this, but I think that George and Martha carry that burden. And even though they are Freud, Marx, and Sartre never mentioned in the movie, I think that they are the elephant in George and Martha's living room. So, I don't know if that answers the question specifically. And it gets played out. All of those ideas get played out in their marriage, in their this evening, this late night, whatever it is, debacle, this after party, whatever drinks, many drinks they have.
Yeah, it's something that's so profound about that movie is that although it never symbolically treats any of these things in some sort of heavy-handed way, it's sort of the nuclear age is in there too. There's so much about mid-20th century America and Europe, just the kind of different strains of thought that were in vogue at the time that goes into the script without them ever mentioning those things.
Right. Yes, exactly.
And something else I thought of when you were just talking about Moss and Menken is that, they were sort of a lavender couple, right? Like Willard Moss was a gay man.
Yes, he was a bisexual.
Bisexual man.
Yeah.
And they had this long-standing marriage where, all kinds of people, including the Warhol Circle, would come visit them. So there's something that's queer about Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf too, even though it's about two straight couples having an evening together.
The other thing is that Willard and Marie, they didn't have a child, they did have a child. They were also, so the imaginary child, well, this is complicated too, and interesting as far as I'm concerned. Edward Albee was adopted. And I think that his adoption, he grew up in a baronial opulence, but in a household of emotional bankruptcy. And hence I think that's also how he came to write absurdist plays, because his childhood was absurd. So he had to address and navigate his own adoption. His mother would get furious at him and say, if you're not good, I'll send you back to the orphanage. So he grew up with that threat. That said, the imaginary child, as I've thought about it over time in writing about George and Martha's imaginary child and then discovering Willard and Marie, Marie said something about Albee. She said, he used to come here and have dinner and listen to Willard and me argue. And then he went off and wrote Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. That's supposed to be me and Willard arguing about my miscarriage. I then learned from Gerard Malenka, who was, Willard was his mentor as a poet. And Gerard said to me that, no, they actually had a baby, but the baby died after a week. There was some problem. And so either she had a miscarriage or she had a baby that died within a week. And then also Willard had a son by a previous marriage. So the idea of a child in this marriage, or a childless marriage, I think was palpable with Willard and Marie, and hence George and Martha. So that's just to extrapolate from the queer marriage, the Lavender marriage, the unconventional marriage.
All right, speaking of marriages, I wanted to talk about the producer-director relationship in this movie between Ernest Lehman
Yes.
and Mike Nichols, which is almost like a marriage in its productive tensions and its
Yes.
ongoing struggles. And there's so many anecdotes you could tell there. But can you talk a little bit about how they disagreed, what they disagreed
Yes.
on, and how they kind of managed the production together?
Yes. So one thing, something I wanted to explore is the relationship between the producer and director in any film, and the shifting power. Who holds the power at any given point? The producer, clearly, he holds the purse strings. The director has the vision. The producer has to help the director get there. In this case, Ernest Lehman was 49, seasoned Hollywood, screenwriter. He was known by everyone. He was nominated for several Academy Awards. He wrote Sabrina, he wrote North by Northwest, he wrote Executive Suite. He was a really serious professional guy. Here's Mike Nichols, who comes from New York, young, brash, 33.
Never directed a movie.
Never directed a movie, but with a kind of auteur that, not auteur as a filmmaker, but hauteur, as a kind of arrogance, and but well-founded, I hate to say. And so he just starts taking over slowly, but hilariously, and also he could be a real shit at times. And he basically cowed, if that's the right word, Ernest Lehman consistently. He would mock him. He would taunt him. So one of the things Mike is a really fascinating guy. He was a genius. He came from New York to LA. I also think there was a kind of dividing line, the New York Hollywood snobbery that Mike Nichols brought to Hollywood. It seemed that everyone was somewhat inferior in his way of dealing with things. And excuse me, getting over the kind of endless virus that is in New York. I hope I'm not contagious. I promise. Anyway, so they would battle. They would do battle all the time. One of the most significant battles in terms of the movie itself is that Ernest Lehman wrote the screenplay. He was the producer and screenwriter. He wrote 6 versions of a screenplay that expounded on Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. It sort of maintained some loose fidelity to the play. And Mike was intent on kind of stripping away what Ernest Lehman wrote. And so there's a quote. Mike would say, while he was interviewed during the production, he said, my job is not to fix what Albee wrote, but to reveal it. And so what he did, which I think is brilliant, and part of what makes the movie so good, is he did strip away Ernest Lehman's script to get to Edward Albee's dialogue directly. And so when Edward Albee finally saw the film, he was invited out to Hollywood to see a screening of it before it came out. And he was so annoyed that Ernest Lehman had the screenwriting credit. He later told his biographer, every line in the film is my fucking play word for word. And why does Ernest Lehman get this credit?
Yeah.
So,
And it seems like that's fairly true, right? In the
Oh,
end,
yes.
they stripped out an hour or so of dialogue,
Yes.
but everything that was there was
Yes.
always.
The only difference is that in the movie, yes, the dialogue was the same, but the set was different. They moved to the roadhouse, which was not in the play, and the backyard, which was not in the play.
Right, they opened it up.
They opened it up, yeah. But so Mike, Mike basically castrated Ernest Lehman by stripping away his screenplay to get back to the original Albee. But that was, I think, a revolutionary act.
I mean, you just have so many great stories. You have to read the book to get them all, but all the different passive-aggressive dumpings of responsibility that one would do on
the antics. These are two neurotic Jewish men from New York. And one was 15 years older, so the power was constantly shifting. And Mike was really, I mean, if you've ever seen it, I'm sure all of you have seen, Nichols and May skits. He is so deadpan. So he would say things to Edward Albee, Ernest Lehman, that would send Ernest Lehman into kind of just a tizzy. So for example, Mike, he could be very grandiose. He goes to LA and he rents Cole Porter's estate. Cole Porter had just died. So he has this grand estate. He buys a Lincoln Continental convertible. He's 33, he's never made a movie before, but he's got this kind of grand life. His best friends, and this is all true, this isn't, his best friends in New York are Leonard Bernstein, Stephen Sondheim, Richard Avedon, Susan Sontag, Andre Previn and his wife. And so Andre Previn they're in LA for some reason, maybe they live there at this point, I don't know. But they come over for dinner all the time. And so Mike is always telling Ernest that, oh, the Previns were at my house last night for dinner and I played the piano with Andre, and I know who we should have as the composer for this film. It should be Andre Previn. And he basically just tries to usurp Lehman's authority all the time, but not just Lehman's authority, but Lehman's sense of himself as an accomplished person in the world. And Mike is just constantly doing this to him. It's both hilarious, it's kind of like psychological vaudeville on some level. I talk about it in that sense. And yes, I wish I can't cite specific anecdotes that are kind of laugh out loud funny, but
yeah, I particularly love the part where Nichols is trying to convince Lehman to buy a piece of jewelry for Elizabeth Taylor,
yes.
because it's part of her, I guess it's part of her usual courtship with a new
Yes.
film production, right?
Yes.
Somebody has to give her some jewelry, so he's asking him to reach into his own pocket and buy some kind of vintage
Right.
jewels for Elizabeth
And
Taylor,
it's
and
only-
Lehman says, absolutely not.
it's only $13,000. Do you want me to read a second little? This is just a Mike
Sure,
Nichols.
if it belongs here, absolutely.
It's only. It's interesting. Or not. It's too many things. Wait. Sorry. Just before the July 4th weekend, Ernie Lehman and Mike Nichols each received handwritten notes from Jack Warner, who had read the estimated script and said that it was just too long. They needed to cut it further before having it printed and distributed to the actors. So over the holiday weekend, Ernie and Mike went to work, parking themselves by the Greek statues on Mike's patio and whittling 20 more minutes out of the script. Mike's house assistant, Luis, served them lunch under the umbrella and brought them iced tea and later drinks throughout the afternoon. On the day before the actors were due to report for rehearsal, Ernie and Mike once again worked together by the pool to further trim the script. The Albee play is such a bald, true depiction of human nature, and on the darkening eve of production, Nichols questioned aloud his ability to make a film that would get it right. He had been gravely concerned about how to get the actors to inhabit their complicated roles, and in particular, Elizabeth Taylor. Martha was a challenge, and Mike believed the most important character to get right. There is no such thing as a tough woman alone in a room, Mike observed to Ernie on that last evening before the Burtons arrived, implying that despite Martha's hard-boiled demeanor and her vicious tongue, she was vulnerable, wounded, and lonely. Once again, he lamented the fact that Ernie had not cast Bette Davis instead. Asking Elizabeth Taylor to play Martha, Mike fretted to Lehman, was like asking a chocolate milkshake to do the work of a double martini.
That's so good. I love that analogy. Of course, if Betty Davis had played the role, she would have had to talk about herself saying, "What a dump."
Exactly. I know. I never understood that. I mean, even to this day.
It would have to be a meta-referential kind of moment that would take the audience out of the story completely.
But Edward Albee wanted Betty Davis to play Martha, and so how would she say that?
But since you're talking about casting, it's the perfect place to ask this question, or it's more, not so much a question, it's just begging for more good anecdotes about the casting of Burton and Taylor, because this is something that's counterintuitive to someone who, even if you're a fan of the movie and have seen it and the play, you would think that the logic of casting, if you're going to take this famous couple, is you'd say, well, we have to get Burton because he's the right age and he's the right look and he's the perfect George, and then it's almost like a spousal hire in academia, that Elizabeth Taylor, despite not being the right age or the right look for the part, gets cast as well. But in Lehman's mind, it was just the opposite. It was, we've got to get Elizabeth Taylor, and then it was Burton who was the spousal hire.
Yes, exactly. Yes, he was interested in Elizabeth Taylor. He had not even considered Richard Burton as George. That was not even part of his intention. Anyway, they did hire Elizabeth Taylor, and she insisted that was the only way she would play Martha is if Richard Burton played George. So they thought that was a reasonably good idea. I mean, the thing about the casting that's so interesting, and also about Mike Nichols, which is so impressive, is that here's Elizabeth Taylor. She's 32 years old, the most beautiful woman in the world, most famous woman in the world, playing a character who's 48, kind of coming apart at the seams, a little psychologically ravaged, older, heavier, slightly out of control, and to get her to do that, I mean, hence, just as Mike said, she's a chocolate milkshake, and Martha's a double martini, and so her voice was very high, and she had to lower her voice 2 octaves to play Martha consistently, and it would, she would become really upset throughout the production and get fed up and frustrated because she couldn't do it, and it started to hurt her diaphragm, and so they would have to wait while she recovered, and all of that. So, but Mike was able to coax out of her this performance that is remarkable. That that she does seem believable as a 48-year-old woman. Meanwhile, Richard Burton has such a kind of so ferocious a stage presence and a screen presence that they had to tamp him down. George, by turns, is a kind of milquetoast. He's a bit of a failure in his own mind, a failure, and Martha keeps hammering that in, that he's not the head of the history department. He's just in the history department. He's an assistant professor, and so he has to play this kind of tamped down, discouraged man. And so to get him to kind of like soften his voice and kind of skulk around was really hard to do. And Mike Nichols was able to do that. That's really remarkable. Again, so I don't know. I forgot where we were.
That's perfect. Yeah, you're making me think of the part about Burton's screen test. Where he came off as too Shakespearean and virile and kind of he was too strong and too manly to play the role.
I mean, the thing is, though, in fact, his George, his diction and sort of emotional accuracy in terms of speaking those lines is like stunning, and it's so crisp, but yet you believe him as somebody who's kind of like a failed figure. I mean, he's a failure in his own mind. It's quite a performance. He should have won the Academy Award.
Oh, you can't imagine anyone else after you've seen the movie. Can you talk about who some of the other possible Georges were? You talked about the other Marthas.
Oh, yes, but
Peter O'Toole.
Yes, Peter O'Toole. I'm not going to remember that. I mean, I don't remember.
Yeah, James Mason was on somebody's wish list.
Jack Lemmon was actually asked.
And he turned it down.
Ernest Lehman wanted to cast Jack Lemmon and John Ford, and neither of them wanted.
Glenn Ford.
Glenn Ford. Thank you, sorry, Glenn Ford. Neither of them wanted the role. They just thought, like, no, I don't want to do this. This just destroy my career. But the reason he wanted them is because they could play a George. They could play, men who were not quite as virile seeming as
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, you kind of answered my next question, so I'm going to ask one more casting question, which
Okay.
is what about Nick and Honey? Do you have any good stories about George Siegel and Sandy Dennis being cast?
It seemed, no, I mean, it's not, I'm sorry, I mean, no, but it's not uninteresting, but there's nothing kind of funny or unusual about it. It seemed, I mean, Mike wanted Sandy Dennis, it seemed like she was going to be a hard sell to Jack Warner. But somehow, miraculously, oh, I know what he did. He took Elizabeth Taylor to see her. She was in a play on Broadway, and he took her to see her. And Elizabeth said fine, and the reason Elizabeth said fine is that she was absolutely no threat to Elizabeth. She wasn't beautiful in that way. She was odd looking, very odd looking.
Yeah, an offbeat kind of.
Yes, offbeat. I mean, she has this kind of, on one level, all-American, corn-fed look, but she has an odd smile and a very weird way of being, which gave her, real character. Actually, she's a great actress.
There's so many good stories in this book about the presence of the Burton Taylor super couple on set, about the way that their extreme fame and their extravagant habits and their social connections either slowed down the production or affected. There were leaks because of them, right?
Yes.
People got to see bits of footage who weren't supposed to be seeing anything. Can you just share some of your favorite anecdotes about what it was like to be on set with the Burton Taylors in the mid-1960s?
Well, coincidentally, that's my third snippet.
Ah, perfect.
And you didn't even know that. Hang on, sorry. Sorry. Oh, this isn't the snippet. It's not the snippet I wanted. But this is another
I've
snippet.
got the book. Do you want
No,
to
this is another snippet that's actually perfect. It wasn't what I was thinking of, but it's actually right to the point. Okay. By Friday of that first week, Elizabeth's good behavior finally erupted into rage. See, so here it goes. She let the full force of her inner Martha out everywhere but in the actual read-through. As Lehman would often write in his journal, her eyes flared in anger more than a few times that day. First, after the premiere of The Sandpiper, the Burtons were disheartened enough about the film to call it a pile of crap. That Friday morning, reading one review that claimed Taylor to have given the best performance of her career, she became livid and cursed the reviewer all day long, spewing his name and threatening to sue him for libel. At the same time, she lumped her agent, Hugh French, into her molten fury, threatening to fire him because he had failed to stipulate in her contract a 10 a.m. starting date on the Virginia Woolf set instead of 9. After lunch, a new tantrum was brewing in anticipation of being fully made up for Martha for the first time. Elizabeth was scheduled for full hair and makeup before trying on various dresses that Irene Sheroff had assembled for Martha's wardrobe. Taylor started complaining about her exhaustion from the rehearsals. Then she was tired of being forced to lower her voice and to project from the diaphragm. Then her resistance to being made up took a Gothic turn as she tried to renegotiate Martha's age. Martha could just as easily be 33 years old, she insinuated. Clearly, she was insecure about playing such a daunting character after feeling so degraded by the praise about her performance as a free-spirited bohemian artist in The Sandpiper, which she found ludicrous. Lehman's and Nichols' fears that her youth and celebrity would overshadow her ability to meet the challenge of playing Martha were coming true. She had never played someone as old, never mind someone so complex. She could not possibly know what Martha's age felt like, what it was like to be seen as past one's prime. Taylor did not have a clue about being anything less than otherworldly beautiful and could not imagine the day when her own beauty would fade. And yet she herself understood that her superstardom was a force at odds with her ambition to play a serious role like Martha. It was in the middle of the swinging 60s, and a new female archetype was emerging in Hollywood. Elizabeth Taylor's lush, glossy beauty and her increasingly voluptuous figure made her unsuited to play the new emerging American woman, write Sam Kashner and Nancy Schoenberger. On the cusp of the sexual revolution, with guilt-free experimentation and an evolving androgyny, The spirit of the age was embodied by a new crop of leaner, younger actresses, Julie Christie, Vanessa Redgrave, and Jane Fonda. Elizabeth may have helped usher in that seismic shift in the sexual landscape, but by the age of 33, with 5 marriages, 4 children, 31 films, and world infamy behind her, she simply had too much history to play a new woman. Playing Martha was her ultimate gambit, although nobody at the time knew how brilliant a career choice it would turn out to be. Instead, she was suffering the growing pains of an overwhelmingly ambitious role and taking it out on everyone around her. No one indulged her wild delusion about playing Martha as a 33-year-old. Reluctantly, she proceeded to the makeup department. After an hour, she was escorted in full makeup to her dressing room, where Sidney Guilleroff and Irene Shroff waited. They began to assemble Martha, first the wig and then the charcoal suede dress. When Lehman showed up, he acknowledged that the effect was remarkable. Elizabeth looked every bit like a frustrated, middle-aged, unhappy woman. Lehman observed that she had really been drinking too much, which added to her irritable behavior. She got angry that Mike wasn't there yet, but when he arrived, he saw her in the charcoal dress, then a black wool dress, and at that moment, in full costume, cantankerous and disillusioned, she seemed to be channeling Martha herself, and Nichols and Lehman were delighted.
Yeah, there's so much mirroring going on, right? There's just constantly George and Martha invading the real world and vice versa.
Well, that's, also, I talk about the prismatic verisimilitude of their relationship, their real life relationship, and George and Martha on screen. And it went back and forth, and you can see it. I can see it because I've seen the movie so many times. How they are actually Dick and Liz, like in bed, that moment in bed at the beginning, where they're sort of bantering and playing, and they're sort of, they're at each other's throats, and then they're laughing together. And one moment, George turns to Martha, they're lying there, and he goes, "Hi, honey." And it's one of the sweetest moments in the film. And you can see Richard Burton saying that to Elizabeth Taylor, and not George saying that to Martha. And it's I think, stunning.
Yeah, and it seems like that was even a joke on set a lot of the time, right? Like you just read that George and Martha were finding their way into the real life marriage. All right, just a couple more, and then we'll open it out to the audience. I wanted to talk a little bit about Mike Nichols' aesthetic choices in the movie, which you get into a lot, because it was his first movie.
Yes.
Obviously, he had made his name as a theater director and a sketch comedian before that. He'd never made a movie before, and when you watch this movie and see how many things about it are cinematically interesting, not just the acting, but the choice of the camera placement, the camera movement, the choice to make it in black and white. And a lot of those things were also struggled for and argued over. So just to start with one, black and white, that was a big matter of contention.
Yes, that was a big battle between Mike Nichols and Jack Warner for weeks and weeks and weeks. And he won. Mike Nichols won. And this is what he said about black and white versus color. This is Mike Nichols. Here's the thing about black and white, Nichols said. It's not literal, it's a metaphor, automatically. And that's the point. A movie is a metaphor. If it's in black and white, the film is already saying, no, this is not life, this is something about life. And I love that distinction. I think that the distinction between life and something about life being a metaphor, and I think that I talk about the art-making aspect of this film and this production, and there really was a lot of art making that went into it, and serious intention. One of them being shooting it in black and white, and staying true to that idea, and the other was stripping Ernest Lehman's script. There were some wild scenes he had in the movie, or in his screenplay, that had nothing to do with Albie's play. But he was, Mike was vigilant about stripping it back to the original. So those decisions, and then also the cinematographer. There was a big conflict, a kind of scandalous conflict, well, slightly scandalous, where he wanted to fire Harry Strandling. And Harry Strandling was an award-winning filmmaker, cinematographer. He did Streetcar Named Desire and other films. And Harry was 60, Mike Nichols was 33. And before they started production, Mike decided he was going to screen half a dozen films that he wanted to kind of use as examples for how he's going to direct Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. I mean, one was 8½, one was, oh God, what's it called? George Stevens.
A Place in the Sun.
Thank you, A Place in the Sun. Several others, and when he screamed 8½, Harry Stradling at the end of the movie goes, "That was a piece of shit." And at that moment, Mike thought, no, he cannot be on my film. And so it sort of worked out that Harry resigned, but it was basically because of Mike's passive-aggressive, machinations to get him off the movie. And so he hired Haskell Wexler intentionally. I mean, he wanted him, and Haskell was a really great cinematographer and worked very well with Mike. So they were sort of aligned in terms of their sense of what this film should look like.
That's interesting in terms of generations too, because Haskell Wexler to me is very much the new cinema, right? The
He
new
was
Hollywood.
exactly. He was young. He was, not even 40 at that time, which was young. I think it's young. Anyway, but yes.
Yeah, and it's just very innovative
Yes.
cinematography, and the way you describe, him building rigs so that he could follow them around the apartment with a handheld and everything.
Yes.
It's just fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, last one, and we'll turn it out to you all. So your book begins and ends with discussions of marriage, right? And the one at the end is a little different. Your epilogue is sort of about the history of the depiction of marriage in art over the last century or so.
In cinema, yes.
In cinema, but you
yeah.
talk a little about literature as well.
Yes, I start with literature, but that I start with Women in Love, but that became a movie. So I started that way so that I could talk about. Yes, basically it's about. I see it as it's kind of a history of marriage in cinema. It's kind of a genre I would like to establish that isn't really established, and I did that because partly it ended up as the last chapter because I couldn't figure out how to weave that idea and that observation about movies and marriage into the structure of the narrative of making the movie. So it ended up at the end. And what I do is I think that Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is the definitive film about marriage, and against which all other movies are measured. Now that might seem perverse, but I think it's actually, it sort of reveals my own sense of being a romantic. Because, and this is like a little wild jump, but one of my epigraphs is Jonathan Franzen says, Don't talk to me about hatred if you haven't been married. And so I think that I use Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and I talk about movies from the 30s, and this is kind of my list, it's not the list, and I just talked about movies that interested me, and I could sort of be counterpoint to Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. But starting with the women, Adam's Rib, Revolutionary Road. Even though Revolutionary Road, the movie was made in 2008, it's based on the book, the novel that came out in 1962. I can't remember what else before the 60s. Oh, Mr. and Mrs. Bridge. Even though that was made in the 90s, that's about a novel that was made. It was a novel that was written whenever it was written, 60s, but it was really about the 40s. And then after, and I use Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf as a dividing line. Sort of before Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, all the movies about marriage weren't really about the marriage. They were plot lines, in which a couple was interacting with each other, but it was really about the plot. Adam's Rib, for example, with Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy, they're both lawyers, and their marital dynamic gets played out in the courtroom. They're on opposing sides of the case, and it's a brilliant movie. It's all like about snappy pattern and everything, but it's not really addressing the marriage. And I think that that's true of all movies before Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf changed that. So after I talk about Diary of a Mad Housewife, A Woman Under the Influence, Scenes from a Marriage, and here's an interesting factoid. When they wanted to shop the play around to open in Europe, the director of the first European production of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf was Ingmar Bergman in 1963. And so Scenes from a Marriage, to me, has Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf DNA all over it. So that, and then there are others, there's a list of movies. movies, but I talk about them in terms of how movies after Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf started addressing marriage more specifically and more directly.
Yeah, and you go all the way up to, I think, Marriage Story is maybe
Marriage
the most
Story is the
recent
last
movie
one.
you talk about.
Yes,
yeah.
it is.
All right, well, I think I'm out of questions. This was such a
Those
fun
are good
conversation
questions.
for me.
Oh, so thank you. Good questions.
And maybe somebody else has some good questions.
Oh, come on. Don't be shy. Yes.
It seems like,
Thank you, this was fascinating. It seems like Nichols changed a lot. I mean, I assume like any director and producer meeting, they had several meetings before, it was agreed upon that he would be the director for the film. But then like the black and white issue, was that ever talked about beforehand, or he snuck that in afterwards?
I mean, I think he established that idea at the beginning. I mean, the way he came to direct it is through Elizabeth Taylor. So we don't realize kind of the impact of her fame, and how it cowed everybody. For example, this is tangential, but it's good. There was an edict put out before they arrived, the Burtons, in Warner Brothers, to everybody, all hired help everywhere. There were 10 rules that you had to apply when you were confronted with the Burtons, and one of them is don't talk to them unless they talk to you first. Basically, they were royalty in American royalty, literally. And so, when Elizabeth Taylor agreed to be cast, she suggested 3 or 4 directors that she had directorial approval, and Mike Nichols was good friends with the Burtons by then. They weren't married yet. They were married yet. They were. And she put him up for it, and that's how that came to be. So so Jack Warner, who is terrified of Elizabeth Taylor, and the reason I think he was terrified of her is that she commanded $1 million a role, and at that point in 1960, her first Cleopatra was $1 million. Her next movie, which was like a stupid movie, The VIPs, a hideously stupid movie, she made $1 million. The Sandpiper. So in Jack Warner's mind, she was like the pot of gold, and he had to cower to her, and so that's how Mike Nichols ended up as the director. So Jack Warner, he had so many calling cards. I mean, Mike Nichols, he could walk into Jack Warner's office. Here is this, novice director who's 33 years old, confronting Goliath. I talk about this, David and Goliath, Mike Nichols being David. So anyway, I don't know if that answers your question. Anyone, please, feed us. Yes?
at what point did you decide to write this book? When you were working on David Flagstaff, I mean, you've written quite a few, thank you. I was just curious when this seed got into your head and you knew you had to write the book, because you've been working on so many over the last 10, 20 years.
True. Hi, Deborah. I couldn't see who you were under your mask. Hi. I mean, my background is really as a photography critic, photography editor, and so I've written several books about photography. I was just ready to explore. I mean, it seemed to me logical because it's still photography versus moving photography, and I was bored with photography. It's not that photography is boring, it's that I used up my curiosity about it because I am kind of an expert. And I say that only because it's, I've arrived at, my curiosity about it has been nourished and used up. And so I wanted to explore something else. And it seemed delicious.
It seemed like a natural progression based on the last couple of books that you've written.
You think it does?
Yes.
Oh, good, thank you. I wondered, but I'm glad.
Going back to your childhood passion is always a good
Yes.
question to answer when you're saying, what should I write next?
Yes, exactly. I think that's true. Yes, I agree.
I can't remember.
Hold your thought.
I can't remember the name of the movie, but I loved it. I think it's with John Huston. Houston. Right, and he's married to a blonde, and they end up separating, and I think one goes on a ship, and they have an affair, because you're talking about this list of, early movies. I think this was in the 40s? It was a pretty early movie, and it talked about, like, this woman, this married woman having an affair, and I think at the end she gets back together with her husband. But that was really about, like, a really forward movie about marriage. I can't.
It would be helpful to know.
Yeah.
But,
I felt like Dana would know the name.
while you think about it,
There was one more.
This question
I'll
over here.
Google it.
I just wonder if you could talk a bit about why you think the film has stood the test of time. I mean, obviously when it came out in the 60s, it was really groundbreaking, but I revisit it often and I find it incredibly impactful. And I
you
wonder,
do. Oh, good. I'm glad.
Why you think even
Yeah.
today it still packs a punch, I guess.
Because I think it taps certain essential truths about human nature, even beyond beneath marriage. I mean, it is really clearly, to me, it's a kind of X-ray of marital dynamics. And whether George and Martha have their own marital dynamics, but I think the X-ray, the observation, is deeper than just their dynamics, and their dynamics represent dynamics between spouses, and it's that's kind of timeless, and the thing is we talked about this, we struggled with this. Ben, my editor, who's right there, we had many conversations about I'm making this sweeping conclusion about this being the definitive movie about marriage and the definitive marriage, not that it's their marriage, but we live in a bubble. These are white middle-class people in mid-century America, but there are so many different cultures and so many different ways of being married, ethnicities, and such that how do I apply my conclusion about this to all of them? And I have an answer. And I talk about this in the book, that it seems to me that no matter where you live and what your background and geography and culture you come from, when two people come together at that level, it's sort of their attachment is at the core, and that core is actually the attachment between couples is like the attachment between a parent and a child. So in your marriage, in my marriage, in our marriages, the feelings that erupt somehow drop down in a half a second down to the feelings you had for your parents at that level of attachment. And so, this is my theory. Of course, it could be debunked. But that's kind of what I see about Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. And every time I've seen it, what they're enacting. I go back to Freud and Marx and Sartre, in fact. That the dynamics, I could cite them. I can't do this right this minute because I'm not going to remember specifics. But there's jealousy, there's revenge, there's disappointment, there's hurt. It runs the gamut, and you see that in the various activities through the evening. And I think that that's timeless, and that's what lives in the movie and the play too. That it resonates beyond its time.
I got the movie with Dodsworth. I was way
Oh,
off.
Dodsworth,
Yeah,
yes,
Liverpool.
right.
But that was
Right.
pretty progressive, that storyline.
It was progressive, but I don't. I haven't seen it in so long. Yeah, it is. I could have included that. I think there are a lot of movies I could have included, to be honest. I just chose what I chose because I only had so much space.
We have one more last question.
I was wondering what your take might be on the title itself and the significance of invoking Virginia Woolf's name in a play about marriage, and I know there have been many interpretations of the title, so I'd be interested to know what yours might be.
The source of it is much more pedestrian. It's because Edward Albee lived in Greenwich Village in the 50s, and he would go to a local bar. The bar was called the College of Complexes. I don't know if you know that bar. It was it then became the Ninth Circle. But anyway, in the 50s, so he walked in one day and ordered a beer, and behind the bar in the College of Complexes was a long mirror, and people would scrawl, little graffiti mottos and things on the bar. And he looked down in the corner, and there it was. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? Somebody had scrawled that, and nobody knows the source. Nobody knows whose brilliant little turn of phrase that was. But he kind of stored it away. This was 1954. I mean, he noted it, and okay, there's that. And then in 1960, when he started to write the play he was starting to write was called The Exorcist.
And which is the name of the fourth act of the play.
Well,
right?
in fact,
Yeah.
the third act, because when he got the third act, it was 3 acts, and so when it was a 2-act play, and then he decided he needed the third act, and he initially thought Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf surfaced, and he thought this would be a good third act, but somehow he then shifted things around, and The Exorcism became the title of the third act, and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf just kind of rose to the title of the play. So it seems rather random. I mean, it is and it isn't, but it's not. He didn't conceive the idea to relate the content of the play to Virginia Woolf in any way. It's basically just it's part of his absurdist, I think, approach to everything. It just miraculously works.
A wonderful little thing in the book is that you include the letter that Albie wrote to Leonard
Yes.
Woolf, to her
Yes.
widower. Yeah,
He
asking
wrote-
permission for her.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that was really wonderful. I love that I discovered that.
And he sort of had to say, this has nothing derogatory about your wife. I mean, not only nothing derogatory, it has nothing about her, period.
Yes, right. And
But Leonard Woolf had no problem.
And he said fine. So anyway.
I think we're about out of time. Philip and Dana, thank you both.
Thank you, Dana.